Welcome to Go Vote Omaha, presented by the League of Women Voters of Greater Omaha. Happy New Year, happy 2021. I'm MaryLee Moulton. I am the Communications Director for the League of Women Voters of Greater Omaha and your host for today's program. The League is a nonpartisan organization. It does not endorse political candidates or parties. Each program we talk about important policy issues. We hope you'll discuss these same issues, and at election time you will be ready and willing to go vote. Today, we are joined by Amanda Barker of Civic, Nebraska, to discuss a timely issue, civil discourse in a time of polarized politics. The country's incredibly divided, but in order to move forward, we are going to have to find a way to work together. With a new Congress, a new president, and the Nebraska legislature about to go into session, Amanda is going to talk to us about the current situation and some strategies to bring civil discourse back into politics. Thank you very much for being with us today, Amanda. So how bad is the rupture in our political discourse, or has it always been this bad?
That's a great question, and a question that I'm sure a lot of folks are asking. The not so easy answer is yes and no. We've always seen contentious issues since the beginning of this country when our experimental democracy began. The one example that I often like to point to is that a supporter of Thomas Jefferson in that particular election year called John Adams a hideously hermaphroditical character. So certainly not peak civil discourse in any sense of the word. So it's been around for a long time, incivility, uncivil discourse. But I feel anecdotally as though that we are in a peak of incivility. So we are seeing some tense moments, and those tense moments seem to rise and fall kind of with cycles of economic distress or cultural watershed moments, which I think we can agree that 2020 certainly was. So the short answer is yes, it's been bad like this in the past. Yes, there are ways forward. So that should give us a little bit of hope as we dive deeper into civil discourse and why it matters.
Mm-hmm. So can you talk a little bit about the statistics about polarization in the country right now? To give us
Sure. Yes, the one that I like to use to kind of illustrate this at the moment is from the Pew Research Center. And in 1994, they did a study about kind of differences on issues. And so they surveyed lots of people, and the point gap between Republicans and Democrats on 10 major issues was about 15%. So how far apart they were measured about at 15%. In 2017, that same version of the study was done, and there was a 36% point gap between Republicans and Democrats. Now, if you sorted those differences differently and sorted instead by age or race or gender or education or religion, those point gaps were not as broad. None of them came close to 36%. But certainly when it came to our political identity, those point gaps have only widened over time, which says something to us and should inform us about maybe the pieces of our identity that are most polarizing, right?
I mean, why do you think that political identity has become such an kind of impactful statistic and kind of how things are going now? Why are we identifying so strongly with politics?
That's a great question. I'm not sure I'm going to totally answer it, but I mean, certainly political affiliation or political identity has deepened in recent years, as that study has shown us. And we tend to identify with a group, as a collective, really in an umbrella sense. And anybody who's not in our group and in our collective is considered an other. And so I think over the last several years, what we've seen is then that othering of any other political identity, right? Some call it tribalism, you can call it that. But really when it comes to this is who I am, and those others are very different. And so it's a real trend towards othering that I think can sometimes be harmful, especially to civil discourse.
Mm-hmm. So let's talk about civil discourse. Why is it really important to how our country works?
Yes, what a loaded question. So many layers to this and so many reasons why it's important. So I'll try not to talk your ear off here, but I do want to dive into some of the really important reasons for us at Civic Nebraska, and those of us who are really civically minded. I would say the obvious reason coming off an election year is that without civil discourse, our democracy suffers, right? We're not able to identify issues or find common ground or work together to, find solutions to those issues or opportunities. And not just at the federal level. Like if that doesn't happen at the federal level, that's one thing. But even as we think about it in a state level or state situation, or even locally in your community with your fellow citizens of insert your community here, residents of those communities. So I think it's really incredibly important for kind of a healthy society, especially democratically speaking. But also it's important for a variety of other reasons. Without civil discourse, people tend to shut down. If that incivility has seeped into your conversation and your kind of your interactions with your peers and your friends and your social circles, then you're going to pull away. And social connection is one of the key indicators of civic health and of vibrant communities. So without civil discourse, people tend to shut down and pull away. And that certainly is not going to heal any sort of divides or unify anything. We tend to lose diverse opinions and perspectives when we don't have civil discourse. Usually it just means that the loudest person or the one that's the most dominant, their viewpoints get shared or repeated or accepted sometimes. And so it's important for understanding a diverse amount of perspectives that civil discourse remain kind of key for any sort of conversations. And then I would say, family units, social groups, those can all be strained because of those relationships broken if you don't have civil discourse. So as I said, multi-layered, lots of reasons why civil discourse is important, from your home all the way up to, the halls of Congress in Washington, D.C., but certainly everywhere in between. Civil discourse is important.
So how do you actually define civil discourse? What is it really?
I use a great resource, and that is the National Institute for Civil Discourse. And they define it as robust, honest, frank, and constructive dialogue that seeks to advance the public interest. So I think there's several key things with this definition, or any other definition. Type it into Google and find out any definition out there. But some of the themes that we see in civil discourse definition is civil discourse as a choice, right? You have to choose civility in these instances. It doesn't just happen willy-nilly. It's usually principle-based. So, those first 3 or 4 adjectives, right? It's robust, it's honest, it's frank. So it's principle-based. It's usually born of dialogue and deliberation. Civil discourse isn't quick, nor is it oftentimes easy. So that's a key theme as we define civil discourse. A key part there at the end of my definition is that it advances the public interest. So you could have a debate or a dialogue about if cinnamon rolls or cornbread better to go with chili, and that's fine, but I'm not sure it advances public interest, right? That's not necessarily civil discourse. But civil discourse is also an exercise or a practice. And I'll get into this a little bit later when we talk about what you can do to advance civil discourse in your life, in your relationships. But it is an exercise. It is a practice. It's ongoing. It's not a skill that you get a certification for and then move on. Mm-hmm. So those are some of the themes. I think an important note from my perspective is that civil discourse is not just politeness or niceness. And I know here in the Midwest, we tend to get a reputation for being polite and nice, and that's great. But civil discourse is not just about being polite or kind. It's about the standards of conduct towards yourself and others in conversation that advances public interest. So civil discourse is not a way to say we have to give blanket tolerance to any idea that is stated. Especially if that speech is harmful or violent, that's not okay. But it does mean that we need to like hold ourselves to standards of conduct towards others, which is important. So that's in a short.
Sure.
Say that again.
What are some of the values of civil discourse then?
Great question. You'll see, I've worked up a set of values of civil discourse that we use in some of our programming. It was tested first with middle schoolers, so I really feel like it's gone through a fire, but it's held up. So these are the values of civil discourse as we know them. It's got to be honest and fact-based. So if you can't have a conversation based on facts, then the conversation is going to go off the rails from the beginning. So that's really important. Oftentimes we pair media literacy or kind of online civic reasoning skills with this conversation about civil discourse so people can understand what is a fact versus what is misinformation. Civil discourse also needs to be respectful in words, tone, and body language. And again, a bit of a disclaimer here, we don't mean to police people and their perhaps their countenance or how they hold themselves, but it's just about being aware of what your signals are. And a lot of like de-escalation training that police departments or others will use or negotiators will use, they talk about like the messages that are sent simply with body language and what that means. So again, not there to police that, just to understand and be aware. Civil discourse needs to be curious instead of hostile. So if the basic premise that you're entering into the conversation with is hostile, then it's just not going to go well from the beginning. Similarly, it needs to be deliberative. You're seeking out information together, not combative. Seeking to understand would be another value of civil discourse. And typically that involves active listening in any sort of situation. In civil discourse, and this is a big one for people to kind of unlearn, it's not a debate. There are no winners and losers in these conversations. It usually means like we're considering the collective. Remember, we're supposed to be advancing the public interest. And so it's not about like this person wins a conversation and this person loses a conversation. That probably won't lend itself to civil discourse. It employs empathy, understanding kind of that emotional discipline of the conversation. And emotional discipline is really hard when you're talking about maybe some of those hot button issues. So believe me when I say like, these are the values, this is what we can aspire to, but certainly I know it's hard. And lastly, the value is that you take responsibility for your attitudes, your words, and your actions, right? So as you are in this conversation, knowing that what you say, you're going to be held accountable for. And that's an important component too. You can't just spew out words and not be held accountable for that. So again, those are kind of in its purest sense. We certainly know that not every conversation is going to go perfectly. I still work on all of these. So these are certainly things to aspire to.
Well, I think that you're giving us some, really challenging things to think about as we try to make the discourse more civil. And we obviously want to see more civil discourse on our politics, and it really starts with all of us. So when we're talking to a friend, when we're on social media, can you give the audience some tips on how to promote civil conversation with people who have different views from them?
Absolutely. And conversations are different if they're in person with a friend versus perhaps online, but generally, there are some things you can do before, during, and after a conversation that will set you up for greater success in terms of a civil conversation. So first, before the conversation even starts, before you log on to Facebook, knowing that the person across from you or that you're responding to is really a human and should not be demonized. Just acknowledge that first out the gate. They're not an enemy to be destroyed. Again, no one's keeping score of this conversation. So that's important. I think a second thing to keep in mind before you go into a conversation, and this might be a little controversial, especially given our recent election, but you aren't who you voted for, right? That's a good understanding. We have a unique and imperfect election system. So candidates aren't perfect, and ultimately who you vote for is not who you are. And so you wouldn't expect the same of someone who voted for another person either. So Also, it helps before conversation to maybe establish your own goals. What are you trying to get out of it? What would be most helpful? And again, consider the public good. And sometimes if necessary, maybe establish some ground rules for the conversation and or an exit plan. So if things start to go in a direction that you don't want it to go in, and I don't mean in terms of the content or the argument, but rather like it just gets too contentious or again, harmful, then you can establish that exit plan or figure out how to gracefully navigate away from that conversation. During the conversation, I would say you need to create space for common ground. And that's mentally within yourself. You have to listen. You have to be sincere in your questions. Sometimes I would also offer acknowledging weakness in your perspective, knowing like, hey, yeah, this isn't my strongest point, and that's okay. It doesn't make me believe it less, but here's what I'm going to acknowledge. I think that can go a long way. So yeah, those are a few things that you can do in a conversation, and afterwards you might need to make some apologies or acknowledge that there was some common ground discovered, right? That will go a long way towards setting you up again for the future. Thank that person for engaging in a respectful manner and perhaps even ask to follow up. So those are a very quick and dirty before, during, after, what you can do to encourage civil discourse.
Okay. And I think one of the most important things just listening to this that I took away is that we're all citizens, and that's really the approach that we should be bringing to,
Yes.
to some of these political disagreements, that we really need to concentrate on that and, and be willing to listen to the other side. But what happens, how do you keep the argument respectful? And how do you refute someone who says something you disagree with?
Very good questions. And there's a variety of tactics that you can use in a conversation. If the conversation is, and you need to moderate like something that's quickly going off the rails, and we've all been in one of those conversations, you can always ask the other person to explain. So say, time out, pause, explain what you just said more deeply. I'm not sure I understand. Explaining is usually a way where that speaker has to then think more critically about what they intended, and it usually forces them to moderate that. They realize that their point wasn't cheaply or easily made, and so they have to slow down, moderate, and focus, and that helps any conversation. You can always use pacing tactics like breaking the issue into parts. So if you wanted, we're going to use the chili and cinnamon rolls again, which is not civil discourse as I established, but tell me first, okay, let's talk about like why we need carbs with our chili, and then maybe what type of carb would be best with our chili. So breaking the issue into parts sometimes again helps moderate a conversation that has gone way off base. Sometimes you can even use their language. So that language and word choice can sometimes get in the way, or clarify, like when you say this, what do you mean? So those are some of the, I would say, tactics to help when things really get off to a bad start or are simply not productive. If you realize like, gosh, this isn't going in the direction I want, here's what I can do. So those are some of them. I think I only answered half your question. Was there a second part?
Yeah. How do you refute something that you disagree with without causing an argument?
Sure. I think the best way that I've seen it done and practiced myself is to say, thanks for your opinion, or that's an interesting opinion that you hold. Mine is very different. Could we maybe examine them side by side, right? So that's not tying the idea to the person, right? Because when that person's identity is so intertwined with an idea, and you're saying that's stupid, I disagree, then you're essentially kind of stopping any hope for common ground on that. Mm-hmm. So separating the person from the idea is the first step. And by saying like, that's an interesting idea, tell me more about why you believe that, but separating it helps.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So in Nebraska, we have a unique legislative body. We've got the unicameral, and what's really unique about it is it's nonpartisan. How have you seen the legislature change, though, in this polarized climate?
That's a good question, and I'm certainly not the only one who pays attention to the Nebraska legislature, so there's probably other opinions out there. I think some of the polarization has occurred in obviously term limits. There are less people that are less elected leaders that are in there for the long haul, and so they're a little bit more beholden to voters or party money, things like that, that help them get elected. So perhaps we see that as a challenge right out of the gate. I think we've seen in the last couple of sessions that some of the divide manifests in ways like rule fights at the very beginning, and trying to maybe minimize influences from the other side right out of the gate, which is always a challenge. And it will be interesting to see how that plays out in the Nebraska legislature starting tomorrow. But and then of course, committee leadership is always another way we see it. We see polarization take place, who gets what committees and who's the leader of those committees. So hoping for kind of that nonpartisan nature and spirit of our legislators to really step up and own the day in these formative first few days of the 107th legislative session, certainly. And of course, all of this is made more challenging by pandemic and some distancing, right? When we talk about social connection as being critical in civil discourse, we're all struggling with it right now. So I'll give a little grace there for our legislators.
So if you are someone who's watching this now, who wants to reach out to their senator and try to promote civil discourse, how do you recommend they do it? What kind of phraseology should they use?
Sure, that's a great question. I think, again, being in a space where in-person testimony is less safe at this point, would recommend reaching out via email. Something we talk about in any sort of advocacy situation is that you need to put your name and establish your constituency. So the address, and say, this is why I'm reaching out to you as you're my senator. Be succinct, right? And say, here's what I'm asking for, either on this particular issue or in this spirit, to say, like, I'd really love to see civil discourse coming from your office and you while on the floor of the Nebraska legislature this year. And here are ways that I think that looks like, right? Bipartisanship, understanding idea, not attacking people, but going farther to understand ideas, listening more. Those are all things that you can call for. Going back to that list of values of civil discourse, calling for some of those within our state leaders would be valuable.
Mm-hmm. Are there particular issues you think that lend themselves more easily to civil discourse in the legislature?
That's a big question. I think any issue that hits home for people has to do, again, with identity and resources this year as well. So that's going to be hard in a year where there's less time to do lots of work. So I don't know that there's going to be a particular issue. I would say usually the positive ones that are easier to practice civil discourse on are the more affirmative ones. Like, what can we build? What are the possibilities that exist for our state, like economic incentives? Those are usually a little bit easier and maybe have bring out less of those tense moments.
So maybe on the national level, we should be hoping that they start with a national infrastructure bill.
Yeah,
right,
great. Yeah, let's give it a shot.
So if you're a politician and you want to be a leader in trying to return to civil discourse, what really should you be doing?
It's a great question. I think the first answer for that comes to mind for me is build those relationships. Because once you build a relationship with someone maybe who you desperately disagree with, right? You just fundamentally disagree with them on lots of issues. If you can see the human in them, it's just going to set up your conversation for greater success, or your conversations. So you're able to approach that person in that before mindset of, they're a human. There's a reason they believe what they believe. I might think it's crazy, but I'm at least willing to listen to them. So if you want to be a leader in civil discourse, you have to be able to build those relationships with people that are different than you, and you have to do that by listening. And then if you wanted to really influence as an elected leader, reasons why you should bolster civil discourse, then you start making the case for being more effective using civil discourse tactics, as opposed to maybe cheaply calling out people.
So what parting advice do you have for our viewers if they want to work towards civil discourse? What should they be focusing on?
I think, and this is going to sound hard if you don't know where to start, but you simply have to practice. Again, it is a muscle. Civil discourse is a muscle. And we've all just gone through an election cycle that could be characterized as tough or divisive. And so we've got a good start. But first, maybe think about an issue that maybe wouldn't cut you to the core if you entered into a conversation about that. And then identify someone who has even slightly different beliefs than you and say, hey, I want to try something out. I want to have a conversation about maybe where we differ on this issue. And I think it would be helpful for me just to understand another perspective, and then go have that conversation. If not in person or face to face, then digitally is fine. But I think you simply have to practice these skills in order to be good at it. And the old adage of, we can't talk about politics or religion, that's not enough anymore. We're not going to be able to solve the issues facing our country, our community right now, if we're not able to talk about those things. So practice.
Okay, well, I think that I think all of us really long for a return to civil discourse, and I think it's going to start with each and every one of us trying to get out there and make changes and demand changes of our political leaders. So thank you so much for talking with us today, Amanda. As we go into the new year, a new Congress and a new legislature, let's hope for more civil discourse and better times.
Likewise.
For the League of Women Voters of Greater Omaha, I'm MaryLee Moulton, reminding you to inform yourself about the issues, and at election time, go vote Omaha. Thanks very much.
That was